Hi, so I'm Hannah. I am a dev evangelist at Codefresh. And so today we're going to be talking about the downside of infrequent deployments. This is going to be a three-part series webinar series. So the first one today, we will be discussing the pain of infrequent deployments. Then we'll have a second webinar that will explore solutions to some of those pains. And then the third one, we will be explaining and sharing something new about Codefresh and about just, just optimizing deployments and things that you guys can look forward to. So I'll kick us off. So as I said, I am an evangelist for Codefresh, but prior to this, I was a API developer. I did work within .NET for several years, so I can probably relate to some of these pains that we're going to be talking about today because I've definitely experienced some of them. But nonetheless, I still love to develop, and I'm excited to now be on the DevOps side and just find solutions, share them with everybody, and that's what we'll be doing today. So as I mentioned, today we'll be talking about essentially the types of deployments that cause pains, headaches that a lot of us experience within our development teams. And I'm going to be identifying what each of those deployments, what those types of deployments are, and digging in a little deeper about what essentially identifies as those types of deployments, what sort of functions and actions. And then we won't get too much into the solutions because I'm going to leave that for our second webinar. So that'll be a little bit more technical, and today's discussion will be a little bit more high level. So I guess we'll start. So first, the three deployment types that we'll be discussing today will be essentially the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, and the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to be walking you through each of these deployment processes and some of the pains that we experience with them, and also some of the lies that we tell ourselves that makes it okay to deploy this certain way. Whether we think it's a good way, we try to defend it, but ultimately, is it really serving us? So I am going to be uncovering a little bit of those lies that we're telling ourselves, and just explain why they do hurt our teams, our organizations, and just hoping that we can do better. And then maybe, as you watch this webinar, you can get a better idea of where you fit as far as your team or your organization, and have a better idea of potential ways that you could improve. And so I'm hoping that you have a takeaway such as that after this webinar. So first, we're going to be explaining the Dark Ages. And essentially, these can also be, this type of deployment process can also be referred to as your release trains, but also this kind of deployment process is also an anti-pattern. And so I hate to shame you if you're familiar with this deployment process, but it's not a good one. I've been there. So we're going to dive into that now. So does your team do the following? I'm going to be identifying essentially what it looks like your team might be doing and uncovering the truth of what might be actually happening. So I guess, first, when you're deploying, the frequency, is it one, every month? Is it once a month? Is it every few months? I know even some organizations who it could be, maybe just a few times a year. And so that would definitely be considered part of the Dark Ages. Also, for those teams who treat their deployments as these monolithic, these huge events, whether it's like a functionality or a new feature to an application that you've been working on for months and months, and then you finally deploy it, that would also be considered part of the Dark Ages. Also, if you're guilty of submitting huge blocks of code in your PRs and there's just a never-ending, exhausting approval process, that would also put you within this deployment process. And then also, just once you have been able to deploy these new features or your new source code, and you finally deploy it to production, what happens if you get an error? What happens if there's an issue or your end user is experiencing something different than you anticipated when you were testing? How can you roll back? Is it really complicated? Do you have to incorporate additional teams? Do you have control over that? If you're saying that you don't have control and you are relying on other teams to help you out and scatter and, you know, perform a rollback, then that would be considered part of the dark ages. I'm not going to say congrats. I mean, it does say congrats, but this is something that, you know, like I said, I can relate to, and it's a pain. So what it might seem like is that essentially you're disciplined and you're extremely cautious. I understand the cautious aspect, but also this can also, what it can also really mean is that your team really hasn't figured out a process that works for you, that works for your organization, and delivering new features still just hasn't, the workflow just hasn't been figured out yet. That could be a multiple reasons. It could be because the software, the technology, it could be because of the type of legacy apps that you're developing on. So there's several reasons as to why this is happening. And sometimes a lot of those things are out of your control. So that could just, you know, it could incorporate a whole entire culture within your organization. So I understand how hard this can be. Also, what it can seem like is that the release, I also noticed within the Dark Ages deployment process that you're hoping with each release that it's going to be better than the last, that it's going to be smoother, that you're going to be able to push this new functionality or feature to production this time. But sometimes what ends up happening is that there wasn't enough time to implement the new feature. There wasn't enough time to test it, to integrate it. Maybe you don't have automated testing, you know, incorporated into your workflow. So the testing process takes longer. It's much more complicated. Therefore, trying to integrate it and push it to a different environment, it takes a while. So I understand this, or it could be because of other organizational reasons, whether, you know, it could be some organizations have meetings where they have to discuss, okay, well, we need to get a cab approval and we need to move forward with this. Oh, we can't approve this in time, so we have to push this to next week or next month. Hopefully not next month, but that happens as well. So the workflow just hasn't been built efficient enough to really push things out quickly. Also, yeah, you know, when it comes to delivery dates, teams will say, okay, well, you know, the business side of things will say, well, okay, let's release this new feature by this date. Okay, but is it feasible? Sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. I don't want to say that it isn't all the time. But what happens is that this can be incredibly stressful for multiple teams. Let's say the development team is, you know, they've submitted their part, they've submitted their source code, but then there's a problem within QA. And then when it's being released, you have a DevOps team that you rely on. So what happens there? There's so many opportunities for error, just simple human error that happens. And so therefore promising a certain date to have something deployed to production, it can be really stressful. And then it also just, you're reliant on other teams. You don't have control. So that's why this deployment process can really be a struggle. And yeah, dark ages. So I guess, you know, what is most important? I guess this type of deployment process, it really does not only just impact your work and your application, but it definitely affects your organization. It creates this frustration within development teams because they're wasting their time doing, you know, just day-to-day things to put out fires. They're not able to just sit and code. And then it really, like I'd mentioned before, it really stresses out these individual teams and it can slow everything down. So as far as like from a business standpoint, having this kind of production process really does just kind of, in a way, affect the the scalability affect the modernization of your application. So when it comes to comparing your application to other competitors, something important to note is how other companies are deploying to their applications, to their services. Because you could have a competitor who has figured out a different deployment process, a different workflow that is much more efficient, where they're able to deploy much more frequently. And therefore they're growing, they're surpassing you. So this kind of deployment process not only just affects all of your teams, but it also really affects your business, which doesn't, it doesn't benefit anybody. And so I understand the hesitation, definitely because I've been from the .NET world, where there is a lot of legacy, there is a lot of caution as far as progressing and moving forward with certain things and certain processes. And so, I've seen organizations suffer from this because the culture just isn't willing to progress, isn't willing to invest in certain processes, technology, software, the cloud. And so therefore it really does kind of stunt your growth when it comes to a business. And therefore your employees are just frustrated. So I'll stop shaming you all, but literally, this deployment process really just not only hurts your developers, but really hurts your organization. So, okay, you can't relate to this. You're like, all right, well, I deploy much more than maybe once a month or every few months or gasp, a few times a year. Good. I'm proud of you guys. That's a good thing. That means that your workflow has been automated in some ways. That means that also you're part of the Renaissance. So welcome. So essentially, what is the Renaissance deployment process? This process is identified if you are deploying maybe, every week, or not every week, well, I guess weekly, every bi-weekly, 1 to 3 weeks, really depending on your sprints. So if you are, typically I've seen teams where they schedule to complete a certain feature, and after that feature has been completed, after the end of the sprint, then they'll deploy it to production. And so I've seen that a lot. That works for a lot of companies, but I'm going to kind of pick at this a little bit and explain to you essentially why this could also give you a headache and why this might create some pains within your entire workflow. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into that. So does your team do the following? And this is how you can identify if maybe this is the deployment process that you fall into. Are you deploying, like I had mentioned, to production at the end of each sprint? And are you organizing your sprints with essentially these really large, complicated features? Does each sprint is essentially like a milestone for each new feature to a service or application? Because I've also seen that as well when you're planning your sprints. And this is hard because I understand why it's done that way, but also it just puts a lot of pressure on that development team and ensuring that they have enough time not only to develop the feature, but also to ensure that it's getting tested within this time frame and it's deployed, hoping and just assuming that everything is going to work smoothly. Oh yeah, and then essentially if you're allowing your devs to have self-service access to test environments, some organizations are pro this, some are very against this. I have also experienced both, where essentially you're allowing your developers to test their own features. So not only just unit tests, but also, it could be other like automated testing, it could be environment test, it could really be anything. Some teams that are smaller do have to do this. Some teams rely on a quality assurance team to do this sort of testing, but that depends. And then also when you are pushing something to production or development environments, if you need to perform a rollback, is that still a manual process? Sometimes you might be able to automate certain things, but ultimately it is still a manual process. It's not something that you're monitoring. It's not something that you have a visualization of viewing when there is an issue and you've deployed something. Or are you just doing the manual way because it's quicker? You know, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that you essentially, you want to automate this process as much as you can so that it is rolled back as soon as it happens. You're not relying on that manual human aspect to perform the rollback and then get you back to a stable environment and then find the root of the issue. Okay, so now we're going to dive in again to what are some of the things that it seems like when you are in the Renaissance deployment process and what is actually happening. So like I'd mentioned, you've got some automated processes. Awesome, that's good. You're a step ahead of the dark ages, but there are definitely some other steps within that process that rely on some sort of approval, whether it's from your DevOps team, whether it's from a manager. You don't have full control and it's not automated. So you're kind of stuck and you're just waiting. That's a huge problem because I've seen issues where, there's people who in the middle of the night are woken up because, hey, we need this approval. There was an error in this with this feature. It's affecting X, Y, and Z end users. Can you please help us? That's it's not easy to rely on, and essentially things happen, life happens, so maybe someone isn't available. So it is really important to have a fully automated system. So what it also seems like is that developers can create test environments on demand. They can deploy their features in an isolated way. That sounds great, but what's really happening is that you devs can't see what is deployed onto those environments or really have an easy way to clean up those environments. So what I've also seen in the past is these environments will be created for these developers. The developers will create them themselves, and then they'll forget about them. And this is incredibly costly to your organization. And also, it's just not an efficient way to run things. So this is important that developers can really see a track or a log of what is being deployed to what environment, so that you have a sense of control, and that also when there is a sort of issue, any sort of issue, that you can identify what that issue is quickly. You have that visualization, you have a dashboard, you have something, as opposed to something like this, which is a huge struggle. It's very frustrating. It's not fun. Just don't do that. Oh, I mean, make sure you have something you can look at. All right, and what else it might seem like is that you're using Microsoft, excuse me, I've got .NET on the brain. You're using microservices, containers, and schedulers to solve all of your deployment challenges. But what ends up happening is that in reality, your developers, when you are beginning a new application or a new project, it's not easy to create a new project infrastructure, the nodes, access a dashboard. Typically, it's like you can create a repo, but then you have to hand it off essentially to your DevOps team for them to build the rest for you. So you're losing, again, that sense of control. It's still a manual process. And so therefore, it can slow things down too, because I know for a fact with my, what I've had happen to me is like, I would create a repository. I would then, reach out to our DevOps team, try to get our infrastructure set up, and it could take like a whole week. I mean, hopefully not, but it would take like at least up to 3 days. And therefore it's like, it's really just hard to push anything, deploy anything, and you're kind of just sitting idle. All right. So what is most important? Essentially, this, like I had mentioned, and similar to the dark ages, this sort of deployment really does impact just your personnel, your workflow, and once again, that stress to stay on schedule. Because, and I guess why, again, because operators, like I mentioned, they need to maintain the workflow, they need to manage and build your nodes, and they need to be there in case there are any sort of down, any sort of fires or anything is down. You still need to rely on these other people, and that's very expensive, and that's just, once again, just kind of something that you can't fully depend on. And then also a lot of time, like I had mentioned, is spent on just spinning up these new projects and trying to get them deployment ready. It's like I'd said, it can take a really long time. It slows down your entire development workflow, and it affects your business. Your developers aren't able to execute the work that they want to. They have to work on other things, and the task sometimes just gets bogged down, and that's always a real pain. And then, like I'd mentioned, testing environments, creating those, managing those, removing those. It's very time consuming, it's very costly, and it can really affect things on your team and for your business. So I guess pretty much everything that I've said root goes down to just it affects your business, and it affects your teams. So these deployment processes, this one isn't as bad. You're deploying a little bit more frequently, but essentially it still really is affecting you in not the best way. So this is what we're going to dive into now. So how should you be deploying? How often should you be deploying to avoid these problems? Well, if you're not, let's say you're like, well, okay, I don't relate to any of this. Like this is old news to me. I don't deploy this infrequently. I'm so proud of you. Like, great job. It's because essentially then you can identify as part of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, it's essentially you're deploying on demand. You deployed 15 minutes ago, you deployed yesterday, you're going to deploy tomorrow. This is a team that has established an efficient workflow, and they have the ability and the infrastructure set up that they can deploy as often as they need to. So I guess, how do you know if you're part of this? Well, probably because you didn't identify with those other deployment processes, like I mentioned. So great job. But essentially what it means is that you're deploying to production as you finish your features. You don't have any specific dates that you're fixated on. You don't have any dates that you need to make sure you have everything built, tested, and deployed. Essentially, you've established a workflow where you can just deploy to production as each feature is created. You're also able to automate your testing, and it's then released into your infrastructure as expected. Also, as you know, when you are within your infrastructure, hopefully you have automated this entire process, your deployment process. So with that automation comes a lot of benefits, because typically you have some sort of control or visualization of the deployments. So you're able to have access to when there is an error, you can then roll back automatically, or you have a system that rolls back automatically. This is really important. And then also, you center your sprints around business requests. And it doesn't have such a huge tech impact, which is really nice. And then your deployment and releases are not always happening at the same time. So you pretty much work in tandem during the sprint. You're not, there's been several instances I know where, like I'd mentioned, the development team finishes their part, then QA is, something's gotten held up there. So then we need to go back to development and say, hey, this doesn't work as expected. It doesn't meet the requirements. We need you to fix this. And then development gives it back to QA. And it's just like this never ending just yo-yo. And it's not efficient. It's not fun for anybody. So hopefully if you're part of the Industrial Revolution, you're not having those problems. You're smooth sailing. Will the slides and our video recording be sent out after this meeting? Yes, Joe, it will be. So, so as mentioned earlier, all of this slide, this information will be shared with you after this webinar, and also I'll provide you my contact information, email, Twitter handle. So therefore, if you do have other questions you don't want to ask within the chat, feel free to ask me afterwards. I'd be happy to help. So back to the Industrial Revolution. So what it seems like, your new features are being deployed to production as soon as possible. Yeah, it is. It's happening because you can develop faster. There's no need to pause your development for releases, and your deployment pipelines are triggered automatically per change. So when you submit a commit, it's then your pipeline is then triggered, or you can trigger it however you'd like, especially with Codefresh pipelines. And so that's a huge plus, and it just automates that headache. You don't have to worry about it. And then if there is an error, you have the visualization to view it immediately, and you can automate a rollback and you're okay. What else does it seem like? You're able to isolate risky features. Yes, this is true. You can. It's awesome. Your releases are less risky and easier to fix in case of a problem as you deploy small batches of changes. Yes, this is true. And you can use tools like, for example, you could use Customize if you'd like to deploy to, a staging environment. You can make changes there, and it's only, and when you deploy to staging, it's only there. It's not within your development environment, your production environment, testing, what have you. And then therefore you just have that freedom to then test something and you're not affecting other environments. And I also know your organization will be very happy in case there is an error and it's isolated. Okay, so what's most important? This sort of deployment process really does decrease the risk of failed deployments. And I guess it's just because you're releasing so frequently that you're mitigating the ability for risks. You're going to have stable deployments. And I feel like especially with like a GitOps workflow, you're able to have the automation that you're striving for. You're also able to have just a huge sense of control. Your developers can do they're much more self-sufficient, so they're not relying on several other teams. And then they also have that visualization, like I mentioned. You can view, there's essentially a history of each commit. You understand essentially what was causing an issue, and then you can roll back, and you can do rollbacks with Codefresh. You can use rollbacks with Argo CD, your Helm releases, really any sort of GitOps workflow. And so I can't stress enough how important that is, and how important it is to really deploy as frequent as you can, because also a huge plus to remember is that when your teams are able to deploy much more often, much more and quicker, this also benefits your application, your services, the things that you are offering end users and customers. They are able to, have these new features as quickly as they're suggesting them. So, I know for a fact that there are other companies who have an application or they have a service that they're providing others, and customers be like, hey, it'd be really nice if you could add this new feature and make my life a lot easier. And then they don't see that for months. Well, that stinks, and you might lose business. So I think that's why it is so important for organizations to understand why it's so important to have a really efficient workflow for your development process and your infrastructure. It really does just benefit your company. It also just makes your developers happy. It makes the people you work for happy, because they really get to focus on the things that they enjoy, and they don't have to worry about the pitfalls of essentially the foundation they've been given. If you have a process that's similar to the Dark Ages or the Renaissance. So that's why this is just so important. Okay, so I do want to stress that this presentation This was a little bit more high level. We weren't getting too technical. I wasn't getting into the specifics of these type of deployment processes and what tools are used and therefore. But I am going to be hosting another webinar that will be a little bit more technical. I'm going to dive into the Renaissance and the Dark Ages, and I'm going to provide you some data that's really important that will help you understand why these deployment processes hurt you and your organization more, and really give you some solutions that you can take back and figure out how you could apply to your teams, because it's really just so important to understand how your business, if you are a tech company, how you're releasing code, because maybe it doesn't seem that important to you, but I mean, we've just looked at it where it essentially really does dictate the success of not just your employees and the talent you have, but also your organization. So while your competitors are flying by you, it's because they can grow. They're able to grow quickly. And so I can't stress enough like how important it is to deploy as frequently as you can and to really invest in some research to figure out, you know, what are you doing that might be slowing things down, and how could you essentially automate that process? How could you essentially, implement a GitOps workflow so that you do depend on Git as your number one source of truth? So therefore, there's always a log, there's always a history. You always understand what is happening with the application, and other teams also have an idea of what is happening. And it gives your teams pride because they essentially have that self, like I mentioned, they're self-sufficient, but they also have the pride of like really seeing something from the beginning all the way to the end. So like I mentioned, today's webinar was just focusing on these 3 types of deployment processes and the headaches that they give us. And then within our next webinar, which will be December 3rd, I will dive in a little bit more about how you can resolve those pains, those headaches. And also maybe we can, explore about what kind of deployment process you currently have, some things that you've done that weren't working. I'd love to hear some of your feedback about this, and if you could relate to any of these and maybe some strategies you tried that did or didn't work. I'm always, love to hear what other people are doing and just see how we can essentially share information for you that helps. So right now, I did end it a little early, I apologize, but if there are any questions, feel free to mention the chat. Also, I do know that Sharon just shared a poll with you all. So if you could just take a second, take a look at it, identify how often your team is deploying to production, how often are you committing your changes in your source code, because we'd love to know, and we want to know and share content with you that makes sense and that's going to help you, because yeah, that's what we like to do. So once again, please feel free to reach out to me. You can either email me at Codefresh, or you can reach out to me on Twitter. My Twitter is Tech with Hannah, and I am once again a dev evangelist with Codefresh. I definitely suggest that, to get an idea of what a pipeline can look like in an automated fashion, definitely sign up for a free trial, check it out. Also, if you do have any questions about some of our features, our integrations with Argo CD, and also just check out our GitOps dashboard, please definitely explore, try it out, add an application, release, and tell us your thoughts, because I think for those of you who are definitely stuck in the dark ages, there are solutions for you, and we just want to help you identify what those are and how we can help. So that's it. Thank you, everyone. And I'll just stick around a couple minutes if anybody has any questions. Okay, so Joe Bailey had asked the question, if you're continuously deploying on PR approvals or commits, how do you incorporate deployment of commits that depend on their commits for others and other parts of the code or other layers, like the UI deployment needing an API and database changes? Let's see. Well, it's a good question. I have to think about that for a second. I guess, because I definitely know what you're talking about, where like I know that we had to build a service that relied on the UI, because if the UI wasn't there, then how could you execute the service? I also think that depends on essentially how those teams are working together. But you know what? I probably will look into that a little bit more, because I'd like to give you a much more concrete answer. So Joe, I'm definitely going to follow up with you afterwards and see if I can give you something or an example that would work best and how that would work within the pipeline. Because I think that's a great question. So thank you. I'll definitely be getting back to you. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions? Or want to say hello? All right. Well, Sharon, I think we're done.
All right. Thanks so much, Hannah. And I will work to send out the slides and the video recording to everyone who showed up today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.